My name is Becca. I'm 21 years old. I'm a college student, and I live in our beautiful family estate. Well, technically, in my estate, which my father left me when he passed away 3 years ago from sudden cardiac arrest. I was only 18, then I had just enrolled in college, when we received this terrible call. 1 minute Dad was fine, and the next he was gone. It still hurts to think about it. The house is magnificent. It's the kind of place that makes people stop and stare when they drive by. 2 floors of elegant architecture. Perfectly manicured lawns and a kitchen that any chef would envy. I live here with my mother, who is 48 years old. Dad made sure that she was taken care of too, leaving her a monthly allowance of $3,000 for life. She surprised me by how calmly she accepted the whole situation, without arguing or complaining that I was the sole owner of the house. She just smiled and said that Dad knows what he's doing. That's one of the things I've always liked about Mom, her ability to handle difficult situations. After Dad's death, my life with Mom returned to a comfortable course. We'd become even closer, if that's even possible. She made my favorite breakfast every morning. We talked about my classes, shared stories about the day. Everything was fine, or at least that's what I thought. That's why what happened a few months ago hit me like a ton of bricks. I came home after afternoon classes and saw my mom standing in our foyer with a strange man and 2 boys. "Becca, honey," Mom's voice sounded unnaturally high. "I want you to meet Fred. My husband." I froze in place. A husband? I think I looked like a fish out of water, opening and closing my mouth, unable to utter a word. "We got married yesterday," Mom continued, as if she were telling me about a new pair of curtains. Fred was younger than Mom. I found out later that he was 6 years younger. 2 boys, 12-year-old Alex and 14-year-old Peter, stood behind him, pursing their lips tightly. But what really unsettled me was not the fact of my mother's marriage. It was that she never once mentioned that she was dating someone. Not a single hint, not a single attempt to prepare me for this news. Just a surprise. "Here's your new stepfather and stepbrothers." I watched in stunned silence as Fred looked around the house. My house. He moved through the rooms with the expression of a satisfied customer who is already mentally arranging his furniture. He ran his hand along the mahogany staircase railing, looked into the dining room, and critically surveyed the library. In the high-ceilinged living room, he nodded approvingly. "Even better than in the photos," he grinned. "We will enjoy living here." Something in his tone made me strangely uneasy. But I brushed it off. After all, when we sat down to talk that first day, Fred seemed normal. Not particularly warm, but not disgusting either. He asked me a few questions about college, joked a couple of times, not very well, but tolerable. Even his sons were silent for almost an hour. I tried to convince myself that everything was going to be okay. Maybe even better than I think. This illusion lasted exactly 2 days. On the third morning, everything went to hell. "No way!" Alex screamed. I just sat down. Peter snapped. And here they are again, fighting over my laptop like it's the only entertainment on the planet. This was not an isolated incident. This has become my new daily reality. The boys were fighting over everything. The TV remote control. The last cookie. Who's sitting in which chair? Even who goes to the bathroom first in the morning. On a particularly memorable day, I was trying to prepare for an important law exam. The chapter on constitutional travel required full concentration, and I had just gotten into a good rhythm when a crash startled me. The door to my room burst open, hitting the wall, and Alex and Peter stumbled in, a tangled mess of flying fists, elbows, and loud accusations. "Get out!" I shouted, jumping up from the table. "This is my room." He took the controller when I was winning. Alex whined, grabbing his brother by the collar. You even played it wrong. Peter snapped, pushing him away. They continued to mess around, completely oblivious to my presence. In the chaos of their struggle, my carefully organized study materials fell to the floor, papers fanned out, and a heavy textbook on constitutional law fell with a crash, its pages helplessly bent under its own weight. "Dad!" Peter shouted, pushing his brother away. "Alex is cheating again." Fred appeared in the doorway, leisurely leaning against the jamb with that annoying grin that made me want to hit something heavy more and more every day. "Come on, Becca, don't be so strict," he said lazily. "They're just sorting things out. This is how young people learn to resolve conflicts." I stared at him in complete disbelief. By trashing my room and interrupting my studies? Mom appeared behind him. She gently put her hand on his shoulder and shook her head. "Fred's right, honey. Boys are just boys. They need to learn to understand their differences." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's the same thing every day, constant fighting, shouting, things breaking, and it seemed to suit both their father and especially my mother. But Fred wasn't going to stop there. One evening, he gathered everyone in the living room for what he solemnly called a family gathering. Standing in the center of the room, he put his hands on his hips and surveyed the space like a general assessing the battlefield. "This house needs serious work," he said. "Everything is too feminine. We need to renovate, change the furniture, the color scheme, everything." I straightened up abruptly. "I'm sorry, what?" Fred waved his hand, surveying the interior. "Look at these floral patterns, pastel shades. It's like living in a dollhouse. We need something more masculine, more suitable for a real family home." "This is my house," I said firmly, feeling my anger rise. "Dad left it to me. Not my mom. And certainly not for you. I'll decide if anything needs to be changed." Fred's face darkened. "Listen, Becca," his voice suddenly became softer, but there was a threat hidden in that softness. "Ownership is just a formality. What matters is who lives here and who is the head of the family." I stood up. "Let me get something straight," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "You're not in charge of anything in this house. You're only here because you're married to my mother. And your sons are here only because I allow it." The change on his face was instantaneous, as if the mask had slipped off, revealing his true expression. His eyes narrowed, and the fake smile disappeared, leaving behind only a cold rage. In 3 quick steps, he was right in front of me, looming over me with his massive frame, using his height as a way of intimidation. "Listen here, you spoiled little princess," his voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "I'm not going to let some student tell me what I can and can't do in my house." "This isn't your house," I repeated, even as my heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be audible throughout the living room. "And it never will be." What happened next unfolded in slow motion in front of me. Fred's face turned a frightening reddish hue, the veins in his neck bulged, and before I knew it, he abruptly raised his hand. He swung. The movement was so sudden that Mom gasped from across the room. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up, holding my finger over the emergency button. "Go on," I said, looking Fred straight in the eye. "Give me a reason to call the police. I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about a man threatening his stepdaughter in her own home." The threat acted like a bucket of icy water. Fred stopped abruptly, his face contorted into an evil grimace, but his hand, already ready to descend, immediately froze in the air, and then slowly descended. Without saying a word, he turned around and clattered up the stairs, leaving Mom and me alone in tense silence. "Becca, dear." Mom rushed to me, her voice trembling, and something like panic glittered in her eyes. I expected to hear words of support, an apology, an admission that her husband had just nearly hit me. But no. Why escalate the situation so much? She continued, nervously wringing her hands. Fred's just trying to adjust. This is a family dynamic. He needs time to get used to everything. I froze. Was she seriously trying to protect him? After what just happened? He needs to feel like a man, Mom continued, almost pleadingly now. Head of the house. You know how important that is for men. Honey, please try to understand. I looked at her, trying to see in this person the woman who raised me, strong, reasonable, independent. But there was a stranger standing in front of me, justifying the man who almost raised his hand against me. Something inside me broke. I didn't want to be diplomatic anymore. Do you want to know what I think? My voice sounded louder than I expected. I deliberately raised it to make sure Fred could hear me upstairs. When he earns enough money to buy his own house, then he can set any rules there. I waved my hand around the room. But this is my home. Left to me by my father. And it will never belong to Fred. The silence that followed these words was deafening. And then there were heavy footsteps from above, followed by a heavy thud. Fred's bedroom door slammed shut with such force that the chandelier in the living room shook. After this confrontation, everything in the house changed. But not as dramatically as I expected. It started with breakfast. For as long as I can remember, mornings have been a special time for my mom and me. She always got up before me, and by 7 in the morning she was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she worked her culinary magic at the stove. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and hot rolls, pancakes or omelets was better for me than any alarm clock. But now the kitchen was quiet. The first morning it happened, I thought maybe Mom had overslept. When I went downstairs, I expected the usual smells and sounds, but instead I was greeted by an empty kitchen. The stove was cold. The coffee maker was turned off. Puzzled, I looked into the dining room and saw my mother through the window. She was sitting in the garden drinking coffee with Fred. I made myself a toast, trying not to make too much of it. Everyone has the right to a morning rest, right? But it happened again the next day. And then another one. And more. A week had passed, and the only sounds in the kitchen in the morning were the ones I made myself, rummaging through the cupboards in search of cereal or bread. One morning, I finally plucked up the courage to ask. Mom was sitting in the living room, reading a magazine. In the background, Peter and Alex were arguing over a video game again. I took a deep breath. Mom. She looked up. Yes, dear. You haven't cooked breakfast in a long time. Everything is fine. For a moment, something flashed across her face. Maybe regret. But that was quickly replaced by a cold, cool detachment, an expression I'd never seen before. Becca, you're 21 now, Mom said, her voice strained, almost unnaturally soft. You're an adult, and you're perfectly capable of making yourself breakfast. She waved her hand at me, as if to emphasize her point. Besides, this is your house. You're the boss now, remember? So you should learn to take care of yourself. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I silently swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, not wanting to start another argument. The tension in the house was already so thick that it could be cut with a knife. I turned and left the room, pretending not to see Fred grinning as he sprawled in my dad's old armchair, looking like he'd always been sitting there. There were changes in the house every day that I couldn't ignore. At first it was the little things. I noticed that Mom's monthly allowance, the money Dad had left so she could always be provided for, was disappearing faster than ever. Bags from expensive stores began to appear all over the house. Fred suddenly became addicted to fine cuisine, and almost every evening they dressed up and went to the trendiest restaurants in the city. We're trying out a new French place downtown, Mom announced, pulling on her coat while Fred was already waiting impatiently at the door. Don't wait for us. I knew these restaurants. Places where snacks cost more than a week's supply of groceries. And every time the bill came, Mom reached for her wallet. The money my father had saved for her comfort and safety was now financing romantic dinners with the man who had tried to hit me just a few weeks ago. But that wasn't enough for them either. Weekend trips soon began. At first, these were small trips to country guest houses. Then, to the beach resorts and mountain cabins. But their latest plan surpassed everything. "Becca, we need to talk." Mom caught me going up to my room. Her voice sounded sweet, but too cloying, as it always was when she needed something. "Fred and I are going on a romantic trip next week." She paused, watching my reaction. "And we need you to look after the boys while we're gone." I laughed out loud, thinking it was a joke. But when I saw her serious expression, my laughter stuck in my throat. "Of course not." I crossed my arms. "Have you even seen how they behave? They're like wild animals." As if on cue, there was a crash from above, followed by a scream. Mom flinched, but immediately pulled herself together. "They are just active." "Boys are always active." "They're dangerous," I interrupted. "They can kill each other." I looked her straight in the eye. What if one of them breaks the other's skull during another fight? What if they break something? I'm not going to be responsible for that. Mom grabbed my hand. "Becca, please." There was desperation in her voice. "Fred and I really need this time together. We've been planning this trip for weeks." I took my hand away. "Then take them with you. They are too small for such a holiday. Then leave them with Fred's mother." Mom hesitated. "She's too old to handle them." I snorted. "And I'm too young." I turned toward the stairs. "Besides, I have plans. Study, classes." The argument lasted more than an hour. Mom begged me, then pressed me to feel guilty, then promised that the boys would behave themselves. But I stood my ground. "I won't babysit them." In the end, they had no choice but to take Alex and Peter with them. In the morning, when they left, it was possible to think that someone had died, from the expressions on their faces. Fred stomped around loading his suitcases into the car, frowning as if I had personally ruined his life. Mom barely said goodbye. She just gave me a disappointed look, the one that I already knew was going to make me feel guilty. But I didn't feel guilty. The house finally became surprisingly peaceful after they left. No shouting, no arguing, no loud quarrels over video games and TV remotes. But their sour attitude has become the new normal. It's the same thing every day. Fred and Mom walked around with sullen faces, sighed loudly, and exchanged meaningful glances whenever I entered the room. It was like some kind of competition for the title of the most unhappy person. Meanwhile, the boys continued their daily war. Yesterday, they had a real fight over who would be the first to use the TV. Pushing, screaming, enough to wake the dead. And Mom? She didn't even look up from her phone. It was as if the constant fuss, noise, and chaos were something completely normal. But their new entertainment turned out to be much worse. Now their hobby is to take my stuff. At first it was unnoticeable. My wireless mouse is gone. Then a portable speaker. But soon their appetites grew. I came home after class and saw that my tablet was missing. It was always on my desk. But now he was gone. I bumped into Peter and Alex, but they just shrugged their shoulders. "We haven't seen him," Peter said indifferently, without looking up from the phone. "I have no idea," Alex echoed him, suddenly very interested in his shoelaces. It lasted for 3 days. They pretended to be fools, making innocent faces. But I knew. And when my patience ran out, I decided to act. While Peter was at soccer practice, I went into his room. Clothes were scattered everywhere, candy wrappers were stuffed between books, posters hung crookedly on the walls. I started looking. Methodically. The boxes. Under the bed. Wardrobe. And there he was. Wrapped in a hoodie and tucked into the far corner of the drawer. My tablet. The battery is almost dead, but he managed to install dozens of games and other nonsense. When Peter came home and saw me with the tablet in my hands, his expression was priceless. "I was going to give it to you," he muttered. I smiled dryly. "How the hell were you?" I took a step closer. "Get out of my room. And don't touch my stuff." But they didn't learn their lesson. A week later, I returned home and found them both sprawled on the living room floor. My laptop is between them. They downloaded a game and played enthusiastically. I rushed forward, yanked the laptop out of their hands, ignoring their protests. "If any of you ever touch my stuff again..." I didn't finish my sentence. They understood by my tone. But the last straw was still waiting for me. I was walking home from campus when I saw them. A woman I had never met before was standing next to Fred. Next to my dad's car. With that expensive car he loved so much. Which he washed and polished all weekend. Which he taught me to drive. I felt my stomach clench. As I got closer, I heard them talking. "In excellent condition," the woman said, walking around the car, running her hand over the body. "I think it's perfect for my commute." My breath caught in my throat. "What's going on here?" My voice sounded sharper than I expected. The woman smiled. "Oh, hello. I'm here about the car. He put it up for sale on the internet." It was as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over me. I looked at Fred. He casually leaned against the roof of the car, crossing his arms over his chest. "This card is not for sale," I said, feeling my anger rise. Fred sighed, as if I were a child who didn't understand the obvious. "You don't use it. It's just standing in the garage, rusting. Wouldn't it be better to sell it?" "It belonged to my father," I said clearly and harshly. "And it stays where he left it." Fred's face contorted into an ugly mask of malice. "You should thank me," he spat. "By the way, I found a buyer for this piece of junk. It's a woman's car. No self-respecting man would drive like that." I froze, but he didn't even think to stop. "Your father." He practically spat out the word, as if it were bitter on his tongue. He obviously didn't know anything about cars. I wrote it like a... Fred waved his hand dismissively. No wonder he was acting like a woman. A real man would buy a real car. I felt rage rising in me. Slowly, very slowly, I turned to the woman, who was still hovering uncertainly by the car, glancing from me to Fred. "I'm sorry, but you were misled," I said calmly but firmly. "This car is not for sale. It has never been sold and will never be sold. I suggest you look elsewhere." The woman nodded sheepishly, cast another glance at Fred, then turned around and hurriedly left. But I didn't even watch her drive away. I opened the car door, got behind the wheel, and carefully backed into the garage, locking it. Then I turned to Fred. He was trembling with rage. "Give me the keys to the garage," my voice was steely. "And don't ever go near my dad's car again." He pulled the keys out of his pocket and threw them at my feet. Keys rattled down the driveway. Fred turned around and, cursing to himself, went into the house. That night, Mom cornered me in the kitchen. Her eyes sparkled with anger. "How dare you talk to Fred like that?" "Stop it," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what kind of problems you are creating for yourself?" I slammed my glass down on the counter. "Problems? Do you want to talk about problems?" I took a step forward. How about he tried to sell my dad's car behind my back? What about the fact that he insulted his memory? He was just trying to help, Mom said hurriedly, clenching her hands into fists. This car is just standing there. This car is mine. I cut her off harshly. Just like this house is mine. And I've had enough. I took a deep breath. Fred and his sons have to leave. I'm tired. I'm tired of their stealing, their disrespect, their endless fights. I'm tired of you justifying everything he does. Are you kicking us out? Mom's voice rose to a scream. No, Mom. I looked her straight in the eye. Not you. You can stay. You're my mother, and this was your home too. But Fred and the boys have to leave. She froze, as if she didn't recognize me. And then her face turned to stone. If they leave, I'll leave. The words hit like a slap in the face. But I didn't flinch. It's your choice. They were gone by the next afternoon. I watched from the window as they loaded boxes and suitcases into the car. Mom didn't even say goodbye. Fred took one last look at me, full of pure hatred. And then the car disappeared through the gate. That evening, I was sitting in Dad's office. Surrounded by his books and photographs, I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. But one thought kept bothering me. It's not over yet. Fred is not the type to leave quietly. I needed help. Professional help. The next morning, I called James Wilson, an old friend of my father's. Lawyer. He dealt with the will and always said that I could contact him if I needed help. When I explained the situation, he fell silent. And then he exhaled slowly. This is serious, Becca, he finally said. Your mother has no legal rights to the property. Your father was very clear about this. But if she decides to file a lawsuit. And then she stopped. I was no longer sure that Mom wouldn't do it. Even if we win, and we do, you're going to waste a lot of time, money, and effort. Not to mention the emotional toll. He leaned back in his chair. My advice is to try to solve this before it comes to court. James' prediction came true sooner than I expected. 2 days after our meeting, the phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I'm filing a lawsuit, she said without any preamble. About the division of property. You can't just throw us out on the street. I closed my eyes, trying to contain my emotions. Then she hung up and immediately dialed James. Let's try mediation, he suggested. Let's gather everyone in one room, invite a third neutral party. It will be cheaper and faster than the court. Mediation was scheduled for next week. I arrived early with James. We sat in the meeting room and waited. The door opened. Mom came in. Her lawyer was with her, a tall, thin man with a strained expression on his face. And, of course, Fred couldn't stay away. He entered last, with the air of a man who is confident of his victory. James immediately took control of the meeting. Let's get this straight, he said, laying out the documents on the table. Mr. Parker was very careful about the inheritance. He assigned the drafting of the will to one of the best probate lawyers in the state. He paused. All the legal details are clearly spelled out. His voice was steady but unyielding. The house, the car, the possessions, everything was left to Becky's discretion. He looked up at his mother. Mrs. Parker, you have received a generous monthly allowance, and it continues to be paid. There is nothing to dispute here. Mom's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But Fred couldn't resist intervening. Of course, she wants to continue the business. Stop it, he exclaimed, jumping up. We're not going to let some spoiled brat. Mr. Stevens. James interrupted him without even raising his voice. You're not participating in this discussion. He leaned back and folded his hands on the table. I'm asking for Mrs. Parker. Fred turned purple. There was fury in his eyes. He turned around and ran out of the room, slamming the door so that the blinds shook. There was silence. I was looking at my mom. She shrank, as if she had become smaller, older. It was as if this struggle was draining all the strength out of her. The monthly allowance is for life, James reminded her gently. The guaranteed $3,000 a month. He made a pause. But the legal costs can absorb this amount over the years of litigation. Is that what you want? Mom didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands. Then to the lawyer. He shook his head slightly. A long pause. And then a quiet, barely audible reply. No. The documents were ready on the same day. They confirmed the terms of the will and permanently closed any future claims. Mom signed them without looking at me. Before she left, I handed her an envelope. That should cover 6 months of rent, I said. To help you settle in. She took the envelope. She didn't say a word. That was 3 months ago. The house is quiet now. Really quiet. It wasn't the tense silence that had hung in the air for the last few weeks with Fred and the boys. Just calmness. I'm still in college, working on getting my law degree. Dad's car is in the garage, polished and well-maintained, just the way he loved it. Sometimes I worry about my mom. I know she has an allowance. If she's careful with the money, she'll be fine. But I also know that Fred's taste for expensive restaurants hasn't changed. I've heard from mutual friends about their weekend trips and shopping. It's her choice. We all make our own decisions. And we live with their consequences. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.